Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. The webinar is going to begin in a few minutes. Good evening, everyone. Our webinar is going to start in a few moments. We don't have music on at the moment because of Sphera. We'll be starting in about a minute or so. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be starting in a minute. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here tonight. It is really so great that you've come on to sign on for tonight. I'm Dr. Kali Namdar from OHEL, and tonight's webinar and panel discussion, Hearts in Israel, Minds on Camp, Preparing for a Summer Amidst Israel's Conflict, is brought to you by OHEL's Helpline for camp staff, which offers confidential support for camp staff over the summer. And we're open from 2 to 4 p.m., Monday through Wednesday, 718-686-3230. And we're really grateful to the support of UJA Federation New York, and we're also proud to partner with OHEL's Camp Kaylee for tonight's webinar. During the webinar tonight, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box, and if you'd like to ask a question anonymously, please do. We'll do our best to answer all questions that we're receiving live tonight. In preparing for tonight's webinar, I was in touch with Danielle Tannen, a valued staff member at Camp Kaylee, a head lifeguard at Camp Kaylee, who's currently on reserve duty in Israel as well. We also have Avi Gans here live from Israel. It is 3 a.m. in Israel right now, and we have a whole panel of incredible speakers to really represent a spectrum of ideas from people who have experience in camp, who have experience in trauma, and those who are actually coming to America, who are live now from Israel, to help us really gain insight into the unique situation that we're facing this summer. Dr. Blumenthal is going to share opening remarks in a minute, and then I'm going to share some of Danielle's ideas, and then we're going to go straight into the panel discussion. Before we do that, I just want to share the bios of some of our incredible panelists for tonight. Dr. Norman Blumenthal is a licensed clinical psychologist who serves as the Director of Trauma Services for OHEL Zachter Family National Trauma Center. And he's also an adjunct professor at the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary and Furkhoff Graduate School of Psychology, both of Yeshiva University. He has a private practice in Cedarhurst, and Dr. Blumenthal is also a Dayan, an arbitrator for the Beth Din of America, founder and chairman of the Board of Education for Kahal, and a past vice president of Nefesh. Avi Gans, live from Israel, is the director of Or Torah Stone's Yeshivat Darkeinu for young men with special needs. Darkeinu is the only Orthodox Year in Israel program for the special needs population. More than that, Avi has been a division head at Camp Kaylee, at OHEL's Camp Kaylee for the last 12 years, where he also serves as the founding director of Kaylee's internship program for young adults with special needs. Avi and his wife, Hannah Esther, live in Alon Shvut in Gush Etzion with their 5 children. And Hannah Esther, his wife, also a Camp Kaylee staff member, is employed by One Family Fund, where she's responsible for coordinating volunteer efforts on behalf of bereaved families and victims of terror. Since October 7, their daughter Meira has also been actively engaging full-time with a community of evacuees from Israel's northern border. And we're so thrilled and grateful, Avi, for you to be here tonight. Tamar Sheffi, LCSW, is a member of OHEL's National Trauma Team and Crisis Team, and she's also the Director of Guidance at Yeshiva University High School for Boys. And she's worked with the adolescent population for many years and has extensive camp experience as well. She's also presented on navigating crisis planning within a school setting for OHEL and Prisma. She has a private practice, years and years of experience of working with teens, supporting young adults and parents. And Dr. Razel Yaish, another esteemed member on our panel tonight, received her PhD in clinical health psychology from Furkov. She's the clinical psychologist at Mayanot Yeshiva High School for Girls. She's worked with teens and the special health needs population for many, many years. She's also a head counselor at Camp Hask, and she previously was a head counselor at Camp Simcha. She consults, she presents workshops and talks for many organizations on mental health related topics, and also has a private practice. I want you to just, this is going to be a webinar that we really would love for you to engage with. So again, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box and we'll do our best to get to them as soon as we can. And now I'd love to hand it over to Dr. Norman Blumenthal to start us off for the evening.
Thank you very much, Carly. You remind me of the comedian who said that he was going to rewrite his autobiography to include himself. So I want to acknowledge your presence and all the work that you do, and for our school-based program, for the helpline. You've really, Dr. Nanda has emerged as one of the key people in the OHEL team for trauma and working in schools. I'm also very humbled and privileged to be on the panel with such co-panelists who are really quite exceptional in their own right, and I'm hoping to learn a lot myself. I think to orient us towards this topic, I want to hark back to a time in my adulthood when I had reached the point where I was actually making a living instead of being a student. And naturally, I would designate my maaser, my 10% tithing, for tzedakah, for charity. And once I wrote one check to a charitable organization, of course, I got in every single mailing list and would get many, many requests for charity, much reminding me of what my father used to say. Well, my father used to say that if he gives to every worthy cause, he'll become a worthy cause himself. But among the many letters that I received were letters from organizations that provided scholarships for camp. And it posed me with a sort of conflict. Camp is wonderful. I had amazing camp experiences. I have lifelong friends from my years in camp. I'm in no way minimizing how important camp was to me or to my circle of friends and growing up. But when it comes to stuff, when it comes to charity, there are people that are hungry. There are people that need clothing. There are people that cannot afford a Torah education. Should camp scholarships really be such a priority? And I really did a lot of deliberation, and I certainly when I look back on it now, but I think even then I realized, yes, in many respects, camp is an essential part of growing up. It's not for everybody. Some kids, want their creature comforts. Some kids don't like the structure. Some kids have social difficulties, which a camp setting would pose maybe some more than that they can currently handle. But for the vast majority of kids, first of all, it's good to get away. In fact, probably those children who can't afford camp may be living in apartment buildings or some of the more congested parts of the tri-state area, and therefore would benefit enormously from being in nature and the fresh air, etc. Sports, both in terms of physical health and learning, healthy competition. In fact, especially when I mentioned earlier about being in nature, there's a lot of data coming out there right now that connecting with nature helps with coping and helps the development of resilience. The independence, being away from parents and having to fend for yourself a bit more. And in this way, nurturing the very sort of essence of childhood, which is leaving your family and becoming more self-sufficient. the friendships, and no less important, the spirit. I think all of us who have been to camp certainly have very profound memories of Shabbat in camp that was so unique, or the Tisha B'Av commemorations that when done in that kind of setting, instead of being in a synagogue with parents who are just rushed home from work and don't have the time and necessarily the luxury to really focus on the Chorban and what it means and how much more powerful that was. So camp's pretty important, and I do support charitable organizations that provide scholarships for camp. But there's an interesting paradox also about camp, which is a paradox about any time when you leave one place and go someplace else, when you leave the comfort of your home and go to a camp setting. And that paradox is that the more uncomplicated, the more peaceful, if you will, the setting you're leaving is, the easier it is to go someplace else. I say it's a paradox. You might think the other way around. If the place you're leaving is stressful, or the place you're leaving has a lot of unfinished business, you think, well, great, I want to get away from it. But that's not the case, because when things are unsettled in the setting that you're leaving to go to camp, then the more your mental energy is focused there because of worries or because of concerns. So when things are unresolved, when there is unfinished business, it becomes much harder even to leave and to go to something as recreational and as enjoyable as camp. And right now, I have to say, to varying degrees, the entire Jewish community, both here and all the more so in Israel, are really ill at ease. We're not as composed and we're not as secure. We don't feel secure as we've had previous years, and this poses a unique challenge for the children to leave that setting where things seem so uncertain, where there's an increased sense of even danger, and go away even to something as recreational and beautiful as camp. First of all, there may very well be kids who themselves, who's, let's say, have siblings or themselves are in public school, or have siblings who are on the college campus here in America, or if it's the counselors themselves on the college campus, and the stress that this has posed in recent years. And the interesting thing is that sometimes when you're in a threatening situation, while you're in it, you really don't have the luxury of allowing the psychological impact to enter your mind, because you're thinking, let's say if we're talking about the college campus, we'll get to Israel in a minute, but you know, how to get to classes and how to avoid some of the violence that has been directed and perpetrated against Jewish students. But when you get away from it and you can reflect with perspective, that's sometimes where some of the anxiety and concern enters. So we could really have a situation of this group of people, this cohort of those who were exposed to the meteoric rise of anti-Semitism in this country, only really start allowing some of the anxiety, terror, or some of the sense of betrayal to enter the mind once they're away in a setting such as camp. And what about Tisha B'Av? Will we process when Tisha B'Av is not just the Chorban, the Chorban's enough, but as we know, the Chorban, Tisha B'Av represents a history of persecution and difficulties. And how much will October 7th and how much will the aftermath of October 7th enter into the programming and the thinking when it comes to Tisha B'Av? And of course, what about our Israeli children that will be joining us, who may have a parent still in the army, who may have a sibling who's about to be drafted in the army? The very uncertainty, how precarious the situation is in general in Israel. It's like almost every day there's a new element. How easy will it be for them to leave? How easy will it be for them to acclimate to a setting in a different country, perhaps a country where they're not so familiar with the language and the culture, and immerse themselves in the camp world when things that they have left have an element of uncertainty and potential danger? These are all things that we're going to be considering. And these are weighty topics, and hopefully we'll be able to make some dent in it. But certainly I want to invite everybody to continue these conversations and even to make access of this wonderful camp and during the school year helpline as issues emerge. One of the people I love to quote is the great scholar and philosopher Yogi Berra, who used to say, "The future ain't what it used to be. And I think if it ever those terms applied, it applies now. Our future ain't what it used to be. And as we try to anticipate, prepare ourselves for that future, and given the enormous talent, both represented here and that's available in our camps in general, I'm very confident that we'll be able to face all that the future has to offer in an effective and a meaningful way. I look forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Blumenthal. And now I'm going to share some thoughts that were shared with me from Danielle Tannen. Danielle Tannen is a very valued staff member from Camp Kaylee who is currently on reserve duty in Israel. He's also the head lifeguard. And what we wanted to do with tonight's webinar is give you the perspective of people live from Israel who are very much on the front lines and have lived through the war that is currently happening, and also give you the perspective of others here on the ground that are involved in working with camps and schools that can help give, a varied perspective from some of the many, many questions that we have been receiving. So just I'm going to share some of Danielle's ideas. Number one, Danielle shared that he believes it's important that people call the situation in Israel what it is. Rather than calling it the situation in Israel, it's important to acknowledge that we are living through a war. And in supporting campers and staff this summer, it's really important to take a step back and understand the year that people who are coming in from Israel have experienced. When we decided that we were going to put out this webinar, there was skepticism from some who thought, like, why is it that you need to address a topic like this? But in considering who are the people that are joining our camps this summer, we see it as so necessary. Teens have experienced something unspeakable this year. Every teen in Israel knows someone or may have been to the funeral of a fallen soldier, whether it's a friend's sibling or somebody, a shul member, or a family friend, or somebody they know. Most people that will be coming to camps this summer from Israel, staff or campers, know somebody who has been impacted, and many know multiple people. And it's not just something that is going on in Israel or a situation in Israel. This is something that is very much personal for everyone. And having said that, it may also be very personal for people here in America as well. It's important for people to understand, Danielle told me, that many campers and possibly staff that are coming in from Israel have spent the year not in their own homes. They may be living in an evacuation community. Even those living at home may have been living with air raid sirens. We're going to hear from Avigan soon, who can help shed light on this. Some more, some less, depending on where they live. It used to be that people would think of the children from Sderot. It's safe to say that children all over Israel now and individuals all over Israel now have been impacted. Some of the campers may have had teachers that have been called away on reserve duty. Some may have or may not have had, consistent schooling over the year. And many campers have a parent or they know someone, like Dr. Blumenthal said, who they have a close relative on active duty, and they live with the fear that something may, God forbid, happen to that person or loved one. So to start talking about people that you're supporting, we really all need to take a step back and understand what we are actually supporting. So in supporting, Danielle says, there are the do's and there are the don'ts. I'm going to share some ideas here now, but we're going to get to a lot of these throughout the panel. Just like with first aid, we need to know what to do and what not to do. So if someone sees an update on their phone about an injured soldier, right, some people may rush to tell other people and tell everyone around them. And if an American teen might hear that, they might be sad or they might be upset. But an Israeli camper or somebody who lives in Israel, if they hear the news, they may start wondering, do I know this person? Is it related to somebody I know? And then their mind may go back to, a situation in Israel that they knew about, or a funeral they attended, or news they might have heard. And we also don't want to confuse sensitivity with pity, right? People don't like to be pitied, but people like to be given space. So if someone wants to start telling his counselor or his friends about, where he was on October 7th in Israel, it's important to give them some space, right? Nobody should be forced to share publicly or in front of others I'm sharing the ideas of Danielle Tannen here. We just need to understand, and the idea of being a good ear is really, really important. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to share more of Danielle's ideas as we go through the webinar. But what I'm going to do right now is open up to our first question for this evening that we've received. And the first question is, how do we lead and carry on when we ourselves are so affected, right? This, for some people, this brings back, memories of when we were going through COVID. You're in this yourself. It's not a crisis that's external to you. There's this concept of what we call a shared traumatic reality that came up during COVID, and it's coming back here again. And if I could ask Avi Gans, who is signing on live from Israel, it's very, very early in the morning, and we're very grateful to have Avi here with us. If I could ask Avi to help shed some light on this question.
Thanks, Carly. Well, first of all, as Dr. Blumenthal just said, when we're in a situation, we don't necessarily have the luxury of allowing the psychological impact to affect us. So even that question right now, having spent, every single day since October 7th here in Israel, experiencing in every different way how this war is going on, it's sort of there's a dissonance between this concept of, oh, I'm going to be leading campers or staff members, or this, or interacting with families or anything else that might be going on. Because to me, it's not really a question. Same way we have to, one of the powerful lessons of this war for me personally, and as I've spoken to many people, in professional capacities and others, it seems that one of the lessons that we learned, is that you wake up in the morning and you put you put one foot on the ground and you put it into your shoe and you do the next thing and you move on with your day, because we don't have that luxury. I think until somebody's actually in a war or in something so traumatic, we did see, you mentioned COVID. We saw this during COVID as well. We never experienced anything so traumatic, so we just assume our subconscious teaches us that we're not going to be able to do those two things at once. War is going to be so extreme, so then during war, you don't X, Y, and Z. You don't play music, you don't cook fancy meals, you don't plan for the summer, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that both is extremely inspiring, as well as, to me anyway, it's kind of off-putting, is that dissonance where we can do both things. There's something terrible happening literally a stone's throw away in Gush Etzion that has a double meaning. Something can be taking place a stone's throw away. And at the same time, life goes on, the good and the bad, right? You can plan your child's bar bat mitzvah, and your kids also make trouble in school. And both of those things are happening concurrently with the war. When we're talking about how we're supposed to lead under these circumstances, on the one hand, I don't know. And I think that to some degree anyway, I do represent many of our staff who are going to be coming in, obviously not just at Kaylee, but in the camping world. There are so many people coming from Israel to so many different camps and summer environments. And when we come in, we've been leading here. We've been leading, in my case, the American, gap year student population. So that's, there's approximately between 15 and 20,000 people here in Israel right now on their gap year. So we're familiar with the American scene, and at the same time, that's a group of people who's been experiencing something that truly is unprecedented for anybody, in our age bracket. So we are going to do what we've been doing until now, which is we push forward, not necessarily consciously, but rather it's almost it's a reflex. It's something that we need to do, right? The same way we need oxygen, even in situations that are less than comfortable. Some people will do this consciously, and it may look a little bit more artistic and colorful and proactive and intentional. And for the rest of us, it may just look like this is just something that we do, and then at the end of it, when it's all over, God willing, again, referring back to what Dr. Blumenthal pointed out, that might be the time that some of us are suddenly it's going to zoom in. And there may be some more of those challenges with kids. As adults, I think we are more maybe aware of some of the complexities or the details. So maybe the kids will find that kind of vacuum And that's where the anxiety or the terror or the betrayal, use the three words Dr. Blumenthal used, those are the times that might sneak in, and that's something that we have to be prepared for, or at least aware of the possibility. But at the same time, most of those kids coming from Israel, and I would imagine the kids coming from the States who are dealing with what they're dealing with, of course, Americans are dealing with America, and Americans are also dealing with Israel. Whereas most Israelis, I'm not going to say all, most Israelis don't have it as a regular, threat on their mind. The protests in Colombia or etc. But how we're going to do it is, on the one hand, it's uncharted territory, and on the other hand, really the way we've been doing it until now.
Thanks so much, Avi. Rachel, do you want to share some thoughts on this idea? How do you lead and carry on when you yourself are so impacted?
It's a great question. And I know that many of the people on this Zoom participating are camp leaders and camp professionals who are really expert at handling crisis on a minute by minute, basis. That's what we do. That's probably why you're in the roles you are, and probably why this, webinar appealed to you to click into. And the big difference here, in most cases there, we have the same task on one level, that when you're in a crisis, you have to process large amounts of information coming at you, often at a fast pace. You're processing strong emotion, right? That comes along with the crisis, either from the actual crisis or the people who are handling the crisis. And you're hearing a lot of different opinions, also different, quickly. I think one of the reasons Dr. Blumenthal is so good at what he does, and Tamara's on crisis teams and comes in, is you're helping sort of make sense of all the opinions and sort of giving space for them, but also, sometimes there are decisions that have to be made. So in this particular case, when you add in the mix that we are in the crisis, so whatever news we're going to hear, if it's related to Israel, if it's our Israeli staff, of course, and if it's us as Jewish people immersed in this, we are now in this as well. I thought I would share a little bit of a concept that helps me in life, slow myself down and handle when I'm in that situation where I'm processing a lot. So there's a concept in neuroscience. I took a clinical health psychology degree, so we had to do a lot more courses in the brain than I think maybe everyone else had to do in their psychology degrees. And we learned a concept called exteroception, which is paying attention to the things and the stimuli and the sensitivities to things going on outside your body, and interoception, which is what is going on inside you, the things that are happening inside you, sensitivity, stimulus, response that you're having inside yourself. And what makes a whole healthy person in general is the ability to sort of blend those two into something that neuroscience calls like integrative awareness. So blending the outside and the inside. And I think to do that well is probably why we're successful and what we're all doing well in our camps, is we're doing that well. We're getting hired back because we're taking in the outside, combining the inside. But what I'm suggesting for this summer, that might be something you can consider putting into practice in your camp setting, is that the inside stuff is going to be possibly a lot stronger than it was before, than when you were handling someone else's crisis. And so what we can do is exercise any knowledge we have about the practice of mindfulness and paying attention to ourselves a drop more. And I'm always thirsty in webinars for practical suggestions, so I'm jumping in with an early one, but we'll have a lot more to think about. Is one of the things I was thinking about doing in my camp based on this research is making it a standard for any staff meeting we have with our high-level staff to start with a moment of stillness, which is maybe a little hokey for some who don't love that, but just an approach to say it's okay to be still for a moment, a minute, not longer, to teach that it's okay to take a moment to touch base with yourself before you jump into a meeting. And I thought that was a nice way to sort of practice that integrative awareness. Take even a minute to slow down and be mindful. And I have more that we'll share along the way, but I think that was a good frame for like one way to look at this unique crisis. I just want to say one more thing, which is that not only is it about being ourselves so in it, this particular crisis is no longer, well, it's a blend. It's not like an emergency life or death crisis every minute. It's a sustained crisis. It's a very different kind of crisis. It's ongoing. We're like, yes, on the one hand, Dr. Blumenthal is right. Every day brings its own new set of things that you have to like brace yourself for. And that also, I think, is another reason why when you're in a sustained crisis, we need to slow down and take stock and see we have time to do that maybe even, because hopefully please God, we won't be being hit with a million new things every day. But that is something I thought I would just add to point out.
Thanks so much for that. I remember my days as a psychologist in Camp Kaylee. Things can zoom so quickly in camp, and yet you're in this beautiful nature all around you. So just like even taking that one moment is something that can be so helpful. We've got a number of questions coming in the Q&A box. Dr. Blumenthal, one of the questions we've just received is, to what extent do we need to sensitize the American staff and campers to what Israelis are going through? And how should we do this, right? We're also getting questions about, not everybody, some people, but you get a real mix of people that come to camps, right? You get your people from all over. You even get international people who come in, aside from, the Israelis that are joining. And different people have different levels of exposure to what's been going on with the war. And different people, people have varied experiences. So the question is, how should we approach this? And should we even think proactively about establishing check-ins during the summer? What are your thoughts on that?
I'm having a hard time answering because I think I've been traumatized by Basil's suggestion that I'd have to sit quietly for 1 minute, but I'm going to try to recover from that. First of all, I think the art of a situation like this is, yes, to sensitize and prepare the staff, but on the other hand, not to over-prepare, because you don't want the interactions with the guests from Israel to be very scripted and artificial. On the other hand, you want them to be sensitized. So I think that in the process, we have to strike a balance between creating an awareness and creating a sensitivity. On the other hand, leaving enough room for the interactions to be sort of natural and spontaneous. We have to remember that they're far away from home, very far away from home, not just a 2.5-hour drive down Route 17. And that anything, that alone, assuming, and let's God willing hope that things will be resolved by the summer, or that there will be a real ceasefire, not the fake one. But still, they're very far away from home at a time when the home setting is fraught with fright and danger. The other thing I think I have to consider is that camp, it's an interesting dilemma, and I'm not sure how we'll do this, but camp should be a break. Camp is the summer, is the vacation. So how do we establish that break and at the same time not lose sight of what is happening in Israel? When talking about how much news to listen or follow, sometimes we herald the what it says in the Gemara about when you're supposed to visit a sick person, and the Gemara in Nedarim says that you're supposed to visit them in the middle of the day, the middle of 3 hours, because the early 3 hours they look too good, so you won't pray for them. The last 3 hours they look so sickly that you will give up on them. So the middle 3 hours are ideal. And I think in a similar kind of fashion, we have to keep informed. We have to be aware there's very important developments going on. On the other hand, allow for some exhaling and some relaxation, especially for the Israelis who have been through so much. Remember that there are cultural differences, even if things were peaceful. Remember as well, and I alluded to this, and Avi alluded to it as well, that trauma has a way of emerging later on, and sometimes even emerging when you least expect it, when you're relaxed and when you can reflect. So there could be traumatic reactions that emerge at a time when you least expect it. I would also suggest and that we allow the Israeli students to connect to their bunk mates, to merge into the bunk, before we even expect them to talk about or focus on what happened, and to facilitate that. I would imagine the best that we can predict that once they're comfortable with their peers, then they'll probably more freely speak about what this past year has been about. I would be careful about those kids who have a fascination with violence and with warlike situations, and asking questions or wanting to hear information, not so much because they want to be aware or they want to help the guests, but because it might just really intrigue them of warfare and guns and shooting, and try to steer away from that. And I think 2 more points I would add is, one is we have to remember that no matter what, we can never fully understand somebody else's predicament, even if we're in a similar situation, but certainly if we're not. And that as much as we want to help the Israeli guests to feel at home and to feel understood, and to have an enriching and relaxing summer, there will be elements of their experience, whether it is, as mentioned by Avi, knowing, at least knowing someone, if not several people who have been killed or injured, but even the displacement of having to, I know when I went to Israel this past November, visiting the 1,600 displaced people in the Ramada Inn in Yerushalayim, and what an impact that had. So to know that we're not going to fully get it, and accepting that inadequacy of understanding someone's situation. And last but not least is what we like to colloquially call in the field trial and error learning. Let's be aware that it's very hard to predict. And let's take our temperature and take the temperature of the camp and be flexible enough to adjust and adapt as we become familiar with this unfortunate new situation.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Blumenthal. I just want to share some more thoughts that Danielle Tannen shared. Danielle, for those who've signed on a little later, is a head lifeguard at Kaylee and currently on reserve. And he shared the idea with me that the kids don't necessarily want to be pitied, but sensitivity, there's always room for sensitivity. So some of the Israelis know that the US kids or the kids at camp don't necessarily know what they've been through, but like Dr. Blumenthal said, this is just camp. They're looking for friendship. And, you know, there's no need for it. Often kids will want to say, oh, I can relate. I know just how you're feeling. And that's not necessarily the case here. It's just important to be sensitive. So if a child in your bunk or if a colleague working at camp asks to just stay outside during activity or they need a little bit of space, it's important for us to allow it. And it's also important that counselors really be a listening ear, right? And kids as well. Again, this is a break. This is summer. And the kids have gone through very, very deep trauma. And another thing that's very, very important for us all to keep front of mind is that it's not a counselor's job to be a therapist, right? It's important, I think, from the outset of camp to make very, very clear who to direct things to and what to look out for, right? So that if something comes up, there's an avenue to go to, or there's someone to talk to, and you can refer on if you need to, right? It's also just important, Danielle passed this along, and I really think it's apropos for this question, is that it's really important that camp and school happen, right? The war is being fought so that people can go on with their day-to-day life. And it's important to try to, you know, to mention what's going on in Israel and to have programming around what's going on in Israel. And it also shows those who are coming from Israel that we're there with them. We're focusing on the reality that they face. And, you know, we're privileged to have this summer experience where we can all come together in unity. So I'm going to look at one of the questions that have come in on our chat. How do we make sure that when kids ask Israeli staff to share stories, or when they choose to share, how do we make sure it's done in what's called an appropriate way for campers? So I'm going to address that question to Avi, if that's okay.
There we go. First of all, the word appropriate is inappropriate by itself, because for something to be appropriate means it has been appropriated correctly. And that is something that is almost entirely subjective. So, and that's true for everything, not just this question. It's not just about violence, right? You have to know where it's being paired up with. Sometimes, I'll just give one example. If the person asking about it is somebody who heard about his relative, cousin, friend, former neighbor, etc., that doesn't mean that the counselor is the only educational or psychological, you know, or mental health professional or layperson who should be addressing this. And maybe that's first and foremost, is that when in doubt, do without, and the counselor can say, oh, I'd love to discuss this with our division head or with the, you know, camp mental health professional or so on. But at the same time, to say that it's going to be appropriate, Well, for some kids, they actually need to know the details because this is not an inquisitive question like Dr. Blumenthal just said. What about the kids who are, fascinated by violence? Well, there are other kids who actually this will help their anxiety to know exactly what's been going on. And there, and like I said, and then sometimes it's an inappropriate fascination with violence, and sometimes, which I think maybe is actually most of the time, and this is a general rule with kids asking questions. When I say kids, I'm talking about younger children. I'm not referring to our 18 and 19-year-olds. They want basic information, and as adults who are privy to that information in a more complex and adult way, we right away get nervous and we say, oh, well, how many details do I have to share? And should I pull out pictures that I got on my Telegram channel? And the kid really just wants to know very, very, very basic information. That's A. B, I'm not sharing any news here when I say that in 2024, everybody is, our kids are exposed to so much more than they used to be. And therefore, the thought of I'm going to protect them from X, Y, and Z may be a little bit naive. And therefore, again, I'm not suggesting that our 18 and 17-year-old counselors or older campers should be encouraged to answer those questions. I think the first and foremost, the answer is when in doubt, do without. And yet, if they are going to answer, I think if we as administration or upper staff or whatever we're going to call it are so worried about what's going to be shared, and we add to this already existing level of anxiety or kind of like this, background music, which is going to be shrill violins more than it's going to be the kind of stuff that we couldn't play in the introduction to this webinar. Adding to that anxiety by saying, "Oh, we don't talk about that," probably won't help anything. So I think, like most of this stuff, the real answer is that we don't have the answers. And sometimes for me, a guiding principle in so much of chinuch is Uncle Moshe's guiding principle of just walk beside me and be my friend. Sometimes people think it's our responsibility to lead. I'm going to give some sort of a context that's going to be a home run, and it's not going to be. And sometimes we say, listen, the kid went through it and I didn't go through it. Let him lead. And that's also not right. And sometimes it's just knowing, I don't really get what you're doing. I'm sure you have a legitimate question. If this is something big and it's truly burning inside of you, let's go talk to somebody who maybe has a different perspective. But in the meantime, I hear you, man. That's a good question. Is this something that bothers you? Is this something, etc.? I think that's something that's significant. And on a very similar vein, just another kind of muscle that's in my head with this stuff is when a kid's afraid to go on a roller coaster, and the parent says it's okay, I'll be waiting for you at the end. The likelihood of that kid getting on is very low. Whereas if the kid, if somebody says, "Hey, I know this is a new situation and it's scary, but I'll be sitting right here next to you," you don't have to explain the physics of the actual ride and why it's safe. Just knowing that someone's going to be there with you to experience this discomfort, I think that's one of the main things that camp is all about.
Can I just jump in and add one thing? Avi, I think, said pretty much what was in my head. The one piece is my experience comes from day camp. And so I don't know who we have. I believe we have a mixture of day camps and sleepaway camp people who are administrators who are on here. From a day camp perspective, we have to take another thing into consideration because the campers are significantly younger. We're talking about kids very often going into either kindergarten or first grade. So they're 5, 6 years old. They hear snippets, but they don't really know what they're asking. And they might ask things without even really anticipating what that answer could be, which is very different than your going into 8th grade camper in a sleepaway camp who is processing things very differently. So one thing to prepare your staff for, and I agree with Avi, we have to accept the fact that we can't be prepared for a lot of these things. But one thing to prepare them for is that just because a child asks a question about a specific experience, either to an Israeli camper who was there, or a counselor, or someone who pipes up and says, I was there for Sukkot and I was there when a bomb went off. And they don't really know what they're saying either because they're 6 years old. Is that not every question has to be answered. It ends at the same place as what Avi was saying in terms of that's a great question to ask. Let's see if and then name the address, the division head, the head counselor, whoever and we'll discuss that in a little bit of who do we go to and how we plan. But let's see what they say we should talk about in this, but to remind them that as much as they might want to share their experience, to know the appropriate place to share it is also very important. I think the day camp piece does sometimes get lost in all of the sleepaway camp answers.
Thank you, Tamar. Thank you. We have a number of questions coming in about staff. So in camp, we have a real mix of individuals coming in, right? We have teenagers and young adults coming as staff. You have Israeli staff that are coming in. You have many who are coming straight from the army or who are heading to the army, who have relatives in the army. You have college students who are coming from campuses that are rife with anti-Semitism, and they've lived through whatever they've lived through on their campuses. And many are worried about how the staff are going to mix with each other and maybe some of the differences of opinions that may exist among staff. And people are also talking about creating those safe spaces for people to have dialogue, for people and having those addresses for people to go to. We're also getting questions right now asking about how do we support adult Israeli or American Israeli staff if they're having a hard time because of what is going on for them personally. So if they're being short with other staff. And I think that, you know, what's coming in from all the questions that we're receiving is people want to know about what it seems like support this year in camp needs to be multifaceted, right? Needs to approach, you know, we can't predict the future. We cannot predict what will be. But how would you approach preparing for supporting staff for the summer? Should Israeli staff or those coming from Israel have their own designated, group that checks in every week? Should there be different addresses, different people for people to go to in the camp atmosphere? Dr. Blumenthal, if you could share some thoughts on this, and then I'm going to hand it over to Tamar Sheffi as well.
You should ask if I can remember all the questions to answer, but I'll try. I have a few thoughts. One thing is if there is very discrepant experiences and you need to work together, then you have to sort of engender and create a collective goal and direction that you need all of you to work together with. My father, Osham, was a World War II veteran, and I once asked him if he encountered anti-Semitism in the army. He said during boot training, yes, but once D-Day happened, everybody was for each other because, first of all, survival, and there was that greater collective need. So if there are divisions or if the people have trouble connecting and relating, then I think it would pay to reinforce and remind the broader and greater perspective and goals of the camp, for which we need everybody working together, and that could, I think, diminish some of that. And I think this might be a summer, especially if we're going to have people with very discrepant views. And this was a very big issue when Carly and I spoke at the UJA, where you may even have people who might be present, whether it is some of the workers in the camp, or might be, if it's a camp that does draw from the more general Jewish population who have very discrepant political positions. And it might be a time where relationship building might have to be part of that orientation time, where there are some of those exercises and experiences where people learn to connect with one another, even if they've had very discrepant experiences. In terms of the Israeli staff and the adult Israeli staff, and I can see certainly a lot of benefit if they have some time together, the process between themselves. I remember I was shortly after October 7th, I went to Cleveland to the Fuchs school, to the Mizrahi school, and there was a cluster of wives of shlichim from Israel whose husbands went off to the front, and they're together. And they were a team. They were very much supporting each other. But there's also something very important and moving when someone who is a little bit more removed is connected and supportive, because it's almost like they don't have to. And to be cognizant for the American staff, to be cognizant of the unique stressors that the Israeli staff is going through, and to reach out to them, and to be without making believe you understand it as well as you think you do, but to be open, receptive, and connected to them can also be can maybe even be more helpful than when the more inbred group are supporting each other.
Okay, now I'm really going to try to remember all the questions after listening to Dr. Blumenthal. But I think I want to split it into two answers, and I'll try to be as succinct as possible because I see tons of questions coming in. We have to remember that when we start camp, we have something wonderful built into our system that we can talk about anything we want, which is called orientation. And I know from camp, we get a little bit lazy with our orientations. I know I pulled out what I did last year, and we talked about that something new in the schedule, and we have to discuss how many fire drills we have, and we'll have to do that safety training, and we have, we do the checklist of the things. And this year, I think our orientation, we really do have to explore it in a way that we hadn't had to until now, and take all these conversations that we're having and start it out there. There should be a staff orientation when most camps do it before, whether it be a sleepaway camp where they're up there already, or in day camp where we have them come for a day or two before, or 3 days, however long you do it. And there should be a I'm still in school mode, a camp orientation on the first day, which tells you where are the bathrooms and who is the nurse, and anything we might want to talk about this. So if we put it in the frame of orientation, then we can have our staff, and I start with staff because they're going to set the tone for our campers. You name the concern and discuss. We talk about open communication. These are adults and teenagers. So they are people who can talk, and we can name that concern of who we have coming to the camp, and the different places that people are coming from, and the sensitivities that this summer we need to have that maybe we didn't have before, or maybe we had them, but they were in different areas of life, where how you spoke to people about making comments about what clothing they have, who has the newest Lululemon shirt and who doesn't, and now it's on a more serious topic. So open those discussions, and we can address that idea of different people's perspectives and what is appropriate conversation to have. What is an appropriate conversation to have with your campers around? And what's an appropriate conversation to have with the staff in the evenings when you're around with them, or during breaks or things of that nature? And you, as an administration, should feel empowered to decide what is okay and what is not okay in public spaces. Now, obviously, we can't control what's going on all over camp. We can't. You can make a rule and say nobody can talk about the war. I'm not saying you should. I'm saying I'm being extremist here, and you have no idea who's talking about what. So we have to really take that in consideration if we're going to try to make any sort of suggestions about what is okay and what is not. And you have to look at for your own camp. Is it a day camp? It makes a difference if it's a sleepaway camp. Why? Because in a sleepaway camp, everyone's there 24/7. They're all together, no matter what time. There's lots of places to be having and times having these private conversations. Day camp, they come, they play, they talk, and then they go home, right? What are their ages? When they're in day camp, they're going home to their parents. So they're still under that influence. They're still hearing what's going on at home. In camp, it's all controlled by what's happening there. So just knowing those things make a difference. And then it is to when you name those norms, and by getting the staff on board with the philosophy of being sensitive to others, to be thinking, and it's not only to Israeli staff. We have to remember there could be campers who have siblings who are lone soldiers. There could be American staff members who have relatives who've lost someone very close to them. I mean, it's really across the board, this sensitivity. So that's the first place in terms of what do we do with people with different ideas, is different political ideas and personal ideas, is really that open discussion about what is acceptable and what is okay and what could be hurtful to people, because we go on the positive intent. Nobody wants to hurt. The second piece of, do we have like the groups, and do we do something different for them? I think every single person needs to be told in camp who to go to if you need something. So the same way, this is for any help. Like if a kid gets a cut in their finger, they don't go straight to the doctor's cabin and knock on the door and say, hi, I need a Band-Aid. There's a protocol. They go to their counselor, and then they go to the infirmary, and they talk to the assistant, and then they see the nurse, or whatever it is. So it's the same thing for when something's hurting inside of someone. You're not going to go directly to who, you should know who you go to, whether you're a camp or a staff member. And I even suggest, I'm in Raisel's camp of like practical things. I know that in my school for ninth graders, we create a who's who at MTA when they come, and we orient them, and they see who is their grade, who is the executive, the Minahel, who is the principal, who is their grade dean, who is the head of guidance, who are these people, and what can they do for you. It's the same thing in a camp, so that you can train everybody that this is, practically speaking, who you're going to go to and where you're going to go to. Where can I go if I need a break? Where can I go to if I do want to talk to someone about my experience? The last thing I would just say is, somebody mentioned it before, I don't remember who, is to remember that a lot of staff members, a lot of campers who are dealing with this, first of all, we have a lot of camp members and a lot of staff members who aren't dealing with this on a day-to-day basis, because children and teenagers have this incredible ability to be selfish and self-centered. And while we hate that sometimes, it's really good for them sometimes, because I'm in camp and I'm about to play in a basketball tournament. I'm not thinking about a war in Israel. When is color war? Can I be general? I'm not thinking about what happened to the hostages. They have this incredible, unique ability to really focus on themselves and be selfish. And for those people who are thinking about it, they actually are welcoming the break of coming to camp and not have to be asked about their experience and not have to find a safe space to talk about it. They don't want to talk about it for that amount of time. So we have to really, it goes back to the communication, hear what each person is asking when they ask those questions, when you see what they need.
I'm just gonna, Carly, can I jump in for one moment?
Of course.
Okay, just two things. I think what Dr. Blumenthal said at the beginning is something I'm already taking home from this webinar, because I had a vision of sort of very early on in my camp, creating a space for the Israeli staff to have a once a week meeting, which I think I'm still going to do, and maybe even a WhatsApp group, because our staff is allowed to have phones, so we have a different kind of a setup than some other places. But what Norman said, not to do that necessarily right away, to let some of the bonding happen, because I'm not suggesting to wait until Tisha B'Av to have the Israelis express their experience, which is something we had tossed around as a group potentially, because that would make it too stark, and it's not all Tisha B'Av, it's all different things wrapped together. But I like that idea of creating some of the bonding. I teach a public speaking class in my high school, much to my chagrin sometimes, but mostly I really love it. And today we're finalizing our final TED Talks that they're presenting. And one of the young women, her TED Talk is about her love of camp and how camp is for her, like she wouldn't be herself without camp, and how important camp is for her well-being, the nature, the friendships, the escape from everything, the no phone, the ability to meet people from around the world. So I like that message that take into account all the sensitivity, but also to build some of that camp feeling a little bit before we start sectioning everyone off in the ways that we will need to do, or they will need to have, so they know where to go and what to do. So I'm trying to think myself how to synthesize that in my who's who and what's what to go to. Maybe we'll say we'll be developing a group for, people who are in Israel this year, or people from Israel. We're going to talk about that soon, but allow some of that bonding to happen, with the great risk, as Avi said, someone's going to say something wrong for sure. Someone's going to do so. We can't control like all of it. It's just not possible.
Thanks so much. Thanks. We have many, many questions that are coming in at the moment. And I think one of the points that we have in the questions is, at the end of the day, this is camp, right? And we've been talking about some pretty heavy stuff until now, but we want to also keep front and center the idea that camp is about fun. Camp is the great, I always used to call it the great equalizer, right? Everybody comes into camp. We're all sleeping in cabins. We're all like having this common shared experience. But just in light of what has been going on the last few months, we want to be mindful and be sensitive also to the idea of certain things, certain sensitivities that we may not have considered until now. Ideas like color war, things like fireworks in camp and other things like that. I know that when Dr. Blumenthal and I were in UJA last week speaking to camp staff, we were thinking about, should there be anything different about programming this year in camp? Are there certain things that we should be sensitive to in light of there being a war and people's experiences as they've been through? And I also want to flip the question the other way too. How can we also, from the positive perspective, how can we create and instill hope and build that positive atmosphere while still keeping, almost like giving ourselves permission to have fun and keep the fun, light spirit of camp while also keeping Israel front of mind? And Avi Gans, if it's okay, I'd love to pose this to you. Just unmute, yeah.
Sorry. So I think I heard two different questions, and I'll try to address both. One is I actually just wanted to share a story that took place. I don't remember what day we're up to now, but this happened on the most recent Friday. So a couple of days ago, I was driving, as we often do, to a local Mayan, like an outdoor natural spring, natural pool. I take my boys and some friends. It's one of the most unhygienic and most mentally hygienic things a person can do on a Friday afternoon. So we were heading there, and one of my son's friends asked, out of the blue, I shouldn't say out of the blue, probably because it was a couple of days after Yom HaShoah, and and Yom HaZikaron, and these are things that the boys have on their mind. Holocaust Remembrance Day and Israeli Memorial Day. And my son's friends asked, how is it that people who survived the Holocaust have a problem hearing gunshots and fireworks? Didn't they hear so many gunshots during the Holocaust? Great question for a 9-year-old kid. And I said, it's an excellent question. And I think that the answer is because when you're in it, you don't have time to experience it. And after the fact, it's bringing you to a place that you realize was so painful. So this concept of talking about a war in camp, some camps, shout out to my old camp, Magen Avram, where they never had a war. That was something the camp instituted back in the day. We had field day. They didn't talk about wars, and so on and so forth, and all the educational, things that would maybe attach to that. But either way, saying the word war, if that is so triggering to somebody, I hate to say it, but that kid is probably having a really rough time in camp anyway. If he's doing great until somebody says the word color war, we're not talking about a hypnosis and a magic word. He's been having a very rough summer anyway. You knew about this camper anyway, or the staff member, and that wasn't an issue. So whether the camp decides to have wars or not, I don't think we need to be terribly concerned about triggers. As far as loud noises, that could be something different. That is something, I can speak as somebody who's been in Kaylee. David Charvit, always prepares in Camp Kaylee for us to, we go through when they do the intake of the campers. We get kind of that background. This kid is scared by darkness or rain or thunder and lightning or loud noises or sudden things. Obviously, we're all not expecting the unexpected, and yet we probably had some inkling about those things too. Is there a sensitivity that is warranted? I think that goes without saying, and yet sensitivity, like everything else, most of our experience is within one standard deviation of smack in the middle, and I think most of that stuff is going to be okay. Generally speaking, certainly in Israel, I can just tell you is the real life experience. When they talk about things, and this year there was a collective understanding that there would not be any fireworks on Yom HaAtzmaut, which is standard all across the country. Here we're talking about people where we know that the reality is that we're talking about many thousands, possibly many tens of thousands of people who truly are living with PTSD. And if they're living with PTSD, that's a completely different animal. But if we're talking about kids who have experienced something that, yes, is, to some degree traumatic, that's certainly not my, expertise or how we were going to put grades on these things. Right. Reza said, you got to name the norms. So we've named one over here. And the question is, what should we be sensitive to? Yeah. So the kids may have heard some loud noises. The kids may not have. If there's a particular group. I know that of at least one camp where they're bringing in a group of campers who have been displaced, and they're coming in with that label, and they're coming in with that background. So maybe that's a different kind of sensitivity. I know that there's a handful of Israelis in every camp. Thank God we live in a very international society. Who may have some more than may have, who probably do have some negative associations. That doesn't mean that we have to go overboard with all of those things, but of course, sensitivity is certainly appropriate. And I don't remember the second question, so I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks so much. Dr. Blumenthal, do you have any other thoughts to share on this?
Yeah, I guess a few. First of all, I think we have to remember that our children are not China dolls. They're not these brittle pieces of porcelain. Kids are very resourceful, the vast majority of them, and as are adults. And I don't think we have to tiptoe around them. We might make mistakes. There might be some insensitive remarks. They'll absorb it. They'll manage it. In terms of hope and nurturing a hope, one of the ways during difficult times like this, and I think that's true here in the States as well as in Israel, in which we cope, I'm going to say two related ways. One way is by becoming cognizant of our heritage, our background. We as Jewish people have endured very trying and difficult times, and we've paid a price, as we do today, but we've emerged, if you will, victorious. And camp's a very good place to remember that. Tisha B'Av this year comes out very late, so it might be kind of late to make that as the springboard for those reminders. But an element of remembering that this isn't the first persecutory period that we've been going through, and how we've managed it would be, again, anything that's taught collectively in camp has particularly more meaning than it does when it's taught individually. And also, we're together. And what better place than camp for us to recognize that we are hopefully and remain unified and attentive to one another. And camp is an intensely social experience. So I think it's a good time for us to feel that we have each other to rely upon during these difficult times.
Thank you. Thank you,
Carly,
Dr. Lilo.
can
Sure.
I just to add, and I see there are questions in the question answer also that speak to this of having fun while the war is going on. And Avi explained, it's something that life goes on and something that we have to do. I think it's also right now, Am Yisrael needs a lot of things from everybody around, and it can come in lots of different forms. So it can come in davening in certain ways, it come in donations, and it can come in activities. So there are a ton of organizations that you can reach out to now, 6 weeks before camp. Boots for Israel, Yad Leah, all different organizations that are chesed organizations here in the States that are doing things directly for Israel and are making it fun. And so you're not losing out on that permission for kids to be running around the gym with new boots and writing letters and stuffing them in the letters, and then packing the boots into the duffel bags, and then having a whole party for the Boots for Israel people, which they now know, and dancing the duffel bags to a truck that's then going to take them to the airport, and it's going to go to Chayalim. And so on one hand, you're showing we're still in camp, we're still having a blast, we're still doing all the things that we would do anyway. I'm not running a camp. I don't run a camp now at this point. I did for many years, but if I were running a camp, I wouldn't take away any of the fun activities, incredible programming that we do. I would add things that are appropriate for what we want to get our message across in terms of programming. So you can have, let's say, Shabbos afternoons. You can institute a rotating talk for the older ages and have some people who live in Israel or who have a connection, a sibling with a lone soldier, or something, give their give over their experience there in that type of a way. You can have an optional post-night activity or an optional programming. You can do a programming for a whole unit. And again, we keep saying because Tisha B'Av is so late. Shabbat Savar Tammuz isn't so late. Shabbat Savar Tammuz is earlier. So 3 weeks, 9 days, you can add to. But I think it's important to remember that we're not taking away their swimming periods so that they could go and write letters to Chayalim. We're not taking away their basketball and their machanayim or whatever things, and we're not stopping these days the camps all have concerts. I wouldn't stop a concert from happening, and maybe in the concert one of the songs can be dedicated to, like I would add to what we're doing rather than say we've got to figure out how to not have as much fun. That these are kids and this is camp, and that's what they need.
I think I'm hearing, just echoing what you're saying, Tamar, I'm hearing from other colleagues who are in camp that a lot of camps are doubling down this summer and really learning more about the beauties of Israel and focusing their chinuch, their education periods, their informal education in camp on learning more and celebrating the incredible things about the Jewish people, the incredible things about Israel, and using this as a real educational experience for the kids to have real hands-on learning, and also, like you mentioned, dedicating the things that we are doing in camp in honor and in support of, our brothers and sisters in Israel. And I think one of the things that we know in building resilience is the more that you can connect to a cause and to a sense of meaning and a sense of purpose, the more fulfilled you feel, the more you build someone's resilience, and the more you build that sense of grit in the campers and that sense of hope. And you really help kids feel like the things that they do and the things that we pray for have meaning. So I think that many are doubling down on that. I want to just pause for a second. And I know, Avi, this is not something that you can relate to as much on the ground in Israel, but something that we have been seeing and, unfortunately rear its very ugly head here in America and other places as well, is this cult of anti-Semitism that is sweeping campuses and other places. And one of the questions we've received is, how do we prepare our campers for going on trips with the climate of anti-Semitism that is out there right now, right? Many camps, the campers are visibly Jewish, whether they're wearing yarmulkes or, however they're presenting. And it is a possibility. They may have encountered this before, but it is very much a possibility when going out in a large group on a trip or something that they may encounter anti-Semitism. Should there be something proactive before they go on a trip where we give them some kind of a talk or we prep them? Razel, do you want to share your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think preparedness always is, I like big picture, but I've learned from running a camp that we have to have attention to the details. I think I'm going to refer to Tamar's concept of orientation is always a good space without turning it into something that's big and scary. This question that we came up with wasn't intuitive to me. I didn't think of it. I've been thinking about anti-Semitism in America, but not so much thinking of it in my camp and broadening that out to trips or possibly to, to workers on our campus, as you mentioned before, who may share different opinions, and we hope we'll not encounter anything like that on our campus. We had an interesting thing. We took a bunch of students from my school that I work at to pay a visit, Shiva visit in Kingston, New York, to visit the great uncle of the Bibas babies that we all know now. He lost his sister in the terror attack on October 7th, and his young family still missing. And our driver that picked us up that day, this is early in the stages, his name was Mohammed. And my students didn't want to get on the bus. They didn't want to get on the bus. They're like, I can't go on the bus with him. And we had to sort of reflect and take time to process their moment of fear. And a little bit, we also were like, okay, this is an interesting thing. It's a weird thing. In the end, after a very long bus ride to Kingston, New York and back, it turned out Mohammed was Jewish and his mother is from Egypt. And we had a whole interesting, fascinating conversation about that. But I think it was a trip that presented an interesting challenge, not of anti-Semitism. He was lovely and he was sensitive and he was kind. And we ended up telling him that we were going to this visit because he kept saying, "Are you going to have fun on your trip, girls?" And we were like, "Yeah." And then we said, we're actually paying a visit to a grief visit to mourn the loss of someone that's, that's sitting and mourning his loved ones. But I do think, like anyone who's prepared in a crisis, right? So, like if you think about going back to my concept of being inside outside, knowing both factors, age-wise, this is going to make a big difference. Like, how much do people have to know? But we always tell our campers, right, about Kiddush Hashem, making a good impact in public, behaving properly, wearing your camp T-shirt, and being safe and being smart. We add into those things that we have all. Remember, we have all our safe people, and we have the people we go to, and we let someone know if we see something or hear something that's making us nervous. I am curious, actually, from others if they think there needs more than this, more than just kind of a little bit of a heightened sensitivity. I think it was Tamar who actually said the naming the norms, and we might want to just say it, because I'm liking to believe that our children are not so fragile, not China dolls. Like Avi again said, sometimes it's the one who has the most trauma from hearing color war, who we already know is having a hard time. Not always, but often. I remember also in my note, we had a student who froze in a college guidance meeting, and the college guidance counselor, "I don't know what's happening. She's not talking." And she said she suddenly in the college guidance meeting thought about a young man from Bergenfield, Donnie Morris, who passed away in the tragedy on Lag BaOmer, that he's not going to get to have a college guidance meeting. Like, suddenly came to her mind in this college. But she was already a student who was struggling in other ways. It wasn't surprising. So I don't think we're going to scare too many people by adding in another thing to our checklist of what to think about on a trip, that we have something to consider, that the world now, often there may be people who look at Jews differently. We're always making our best impression. We're always doing right. And we're going to say something if we have a concern. Curious if any of my other panelists think differently.
Rachel, it's exactly what I was going to say. I would change one thing and add one thing. I don't know that I would do this at the beginning of orientation. I think exactly what you
Trip
said.
orientation. Yeah.
Trip orientation. Okay. So before trip orientation, exactly. And I would be open with the campers about the expectation of what they should do. If somebody is saying any words that are not nice, if somebody is pointing out that we are Jewish and they're saying it, we walk away, we continue, like giving them exact, not just this might happen and be prepared for it and go to your counselor, but actually more concrete steps of where if we see that, we're going to walk the other way, we're going to look the other way, we're going to ignore, we're not going to engage them, we're, those kinds of language to give that. You want to make sure that you're not making them feel unempowered, like, oh, I'm going to just let people yell things at me, but more the reasons behind it of, and this is how we act in the Chilul Hashem, and exactly what we were talking about before. But I think everything you said is what was about to come out of my mouth.
Okay. Dr. Blumenthal, I have a question for you here. We've got some things coming in on the chat. How do we prepare in advance if God forbid something, I know we can never predict the future, but if God forbid something were to happen where somebody had to leave camp very quickly, right? Somebody from Israel had to leave camp very quickly, or God forbid something were to happen that would necessitate like a very quick reaction, or just in light of anti-Semitism, what if something happens, someone comes to campgrounds? How should we prepare for something like that? Should we have like a, I know that back from my days in schools, and I know Tamar speaks about this extensively, the idea of having like a team ready to mobilize if there was a crisis, if there was something that were to happen. Should there be a protocol for camps in place this summer if, God forbid something does happen in Israel, or God forbid something does happen as, something comes to our campgrounds? Or like I said, if there's a situation going on where somebody, a camp counselor, a division head, or anyone has something that has happened to them, to their family, and they have to just all of a sudden leave camp? What do you suggest?
So first, we have a model for this. And the model that's been around for a very long time are fire drills. Every school has fire drills, and we're able to do that without traumatizing the children or without making them believe that at any moment the fire could break out in the school. In fact, I would age myself, but when I was a child, I actually went to public school for a while. We had special drills in the event that the Russians would bomb us. We had to, like, an alarm would go off and we'd have to crawl under our desks. And since our desks were made of kryptonite, we had nothing to worry about in case the Russians dropped the bomb. And today, unfortunately, we have intruder drills in schools or active shooter drills. And we do it in such a fashion that we make it very clear that this is in the event of something unlikely to happen. But let's have that in the back of our mind. And by the way, I've spoken to camp directors, and I don't know if they have instituted it or not, but something comparable probably should be done in camps, because if it can happen in school, it can happen in camp. But it has to be done in a way that doesn't convey alarm, but conveys reasonable and thought out response. And we have models for that, so we can do it. In terms of something happening to an individual, I think even if there weren't on October 7th, accidents happen, people get hurt, things happen to people. I once got a call from the rabbi of a camp because a camper's camper's father had died very suddenly at home, and they had to notify the child in camp. I think there is merit to having a protocol or practice, maybe just for the counselors, but perhaps even with the campers in the event of something untoward happening. And you can do it in such a way that it doesn't traumatize, but it prepares people. When something let's say something a camp, as you said, a camper or a counselor has to leave very suddenly for something, you have to move fast because news spreads quickly. Avi alluded to this earlier. We live in the age of technology. Everybody finds out things quickly, and everybody feels entitled to know things quickly. So we have very little time for delay. Obviously, you attend to the needs of the individual first, but once that individual needs have been met, you want the campers to hear about it from a responsible adult, not from other kids, and you want to sort of certainly nip in the bud any kind of rumors, which are almost invariably worse than the reality. So with alacrity, it becomes very important to do a notification, and do a notification that is informative but doesn't over-inform and allows for people to express their emotions and also to feel safe themselves. Again, camp orientation is usually, I think, 2 days. There's so much you can cram in. There are many other, I'm aware of many other issues that have to be discussed, not the least of which protecting any kind of improprieties that might take place. So there is a triaging, and you have to know how much you focus on, how much not. But I do think that in general, if you have a camp, to have some protocol or preparedness for these surprising things that could happen, with or without a war, I think has merit today.
Thank you. Thank you. Avi, I have a question that's just come in. American kids and staff can be very curious, right? And we don't want to put Israelis in a position where they're forced to speak, where they're forced to share. And like Dr. Blumenthal mentioned before, all the kids that have all the questions about all the gory details, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we prepare American campers and staff regarding like what to ask and what not to ask, and what to say and what not to say around the Israeli campers and staff that might be joining our camp? Would it be appropriate to have a conversation with the American campers or with, whoever's joining from any other nationality without the Israelis present? And just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
It's a fantastic question. I'd start with what has been repeated several times so far, and that is that kids are extremely resilient. we have a natural, maybe, but I think also it's a bad habit of, not using any word related to sight around somebody who is visually impaired. Not saying, "Oh, did you hear the news?" next to somebody who's wearing a hearing aid. And that doesn't help anybody. It's the elephant in the room. It doesn't work. So I would say that's kind of like, in terms of a context, is number one, take a deep breath. It's going to be okay, even if they do that. On the other side, which I think this is why the question is a good question, we have, and I mentioned this in the beginning, we have a natural, one of our many coping mechanisms is that if something is not being immediately felt on the inside, we put it very far away from us, so that it becomes this external experience. So I'm guessing that I'm guessing, again, I interact with lots of people on both sides of the ocean. The average American until this war, without a doubt, and obviously less so during this war, but still to some extent, they're asking the question as if, "Oh, you were a bystander, but you were closer than I was. So what do you got for me?" And because of that, they are allowing themselves to ask that question. They don't see it as a personal one. And again, until October 7th, this was part of the daily routine in camp. Right? You'd have the American kid ask the Israeli kid, "Oh, did you ever see a terror attack?" And other than a handful who actually had seen a terror attack, it was a reasonable question. Right? The same way that we're going to ask somebody from Australia about kangaroos, so they're going to ask somebody from Israel about about Molotov cocktails, because the assumption is that this is a part of your life, but it's not one that affects you. And little did they know that I don't know, your kid was boxed out by a kangaroo, or your sister was I don't know, maimed by a Molotov cocktail. So maybe the way to prepare without going overboard is to just acknowledge with our non-Israelis, and I don't know that it has to be done not in the presence of Israelis. Contrary, I think it gives the Israelis some sort of validation in that, yeah, this is your personal experience, and for everyone else, it's maybe a national experience, or call it what you will. Is to say in front of everybody in camp, by the way, and it can even be included. Perhaps again, I haven't prepared for this, but it can even be included the same way we talk about appropriate boundaries. What we do talk about, what we don't talk about. It doesn't have to be a separate section about, don't use the word war, and don't use this, and don't use that. Also, people's private experiences are people's private experiences, right? Kids will ask when the counselor's not around, "Hey, I heard your parents got divorced. Can you tell me what that's like?" Right? Which is a personal question. And if you say, "Hey, I heard that you were in a bomb shelter," that can be a very personal question. In my personal experience, so for my kids, thank God we haven't spent too much time in a bomb shelter. It was mostly a positive experience for them, and therefore they'd be happy to share. For other kids, it absolutely could have been or may still be traumatic, and therefore, just for the non-Israeli kids to just hear, this may be personal. They might not know it, and the moment they hear that that's a personal question, it might work, it might not work. But for that, I go back to the first thing I said, which is, we're resilient. It's okay. Most people will survive this kind of interaction.
Thank you so much for that, Avi. Rick, did anybody want to share?
Yeah, I really love Tamar's idea of that, like, weekly Shabbos story. It doesn't only give, I love Avi's point. I think that we can give those guidelines. I was going to say to keep the Israelis in the room. Similar, I was thinking that would be nice for them to hear that we're talking about this, and they've already got the first question of, "Did you see anyone killed, or did you lose any relatives in the war?" Which I met an adult staff person who said on an adult staff Shabbaton, she already had gotten it 3 times. "Did you lose any loved ones in the war?" Like, as if it was like a normal question to, like, "Hi, I don't even know you yet," like that kind of thing. So I know it's true that could happen. But that idea of the Shabbos piece of having something in the schedule is not only good for everyone, it's good for the Israeli staff, who has now a whole summer. If summer is 6 weeks or 7 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks, maybe I want to do that. And they could think about whether they want to sign up to tell their story, not sort of ask them to do it right away, but they have a way to kind of plan themselves out, to think about opportunities to share. So yeah, I think I back up all that. I think the Israelis in the room, I think it's okay for most of our camps. I'm sure there may be a camp that has a different structure, has so many of one or so little of another that it might be a little bit different. But for most of us, I think there'd be a benefit to saying it together.
Right.
And
Right.
can I just piggyback on the last thing that Avi said? I know that in school, we always say, we're not just here to teach your child Gemara and math. We're here to teach them to become healthy young men. And the same is for camp. We're not just here to teach your child basketball and machanayim. We're not just here to teach them the new camp song. We're here to teach them how to be healthy adults. And so to teach a lesson is an okay thing in the form of what we're doing. So they'll learn what is appropriate to ask and what is not appropriate to ask, and to be told it in the most gentle of kind ways. But I think it's great to look at camp. It's such an informal experience. It's an experience where informal education can happen. And, you know, Dr. Blumenthal said this at the beginning. We think of all of those lessons we learned in our own camp experiences that didn't have to be taught in a classroom with a teacher in the front, but just by handing the ball to the next person in the line, even though you know that person is not the strongest or the bat, not the strongest hitter, and the bases are loaded. And what did you just learn in that moment? What lesson did you learn? So it's the same thing with this. My head went to that.
Right. We've got so many questions that are still coming in. I just want to touch on one. I know our time is up, but I really just want to focus on this one last question, and then we're going to wrap up. Are camps creating memorial spaces for any counselors who may have been lost in the war? Some camps have lost counselors, and this person is wondering how to go about creating that memorial space in a camp. And we know that other camps may be facing a similar situation. Dr. Blumenthal, if you could just shed light on that.
Save the easy ones for me. Thank you. We have, as human beings, we have a capacity to compartmentalize. We have a capacity to hold on to a myriad of emotions and sentiments and allow them not to intrude on one another. And this is not unlike a question we get in the trauma team. This would be the type of question that if there is a death, God forbid, of a young parent, and that year is a child's bar mitzvah, you don't want the bar mitzvah to be funeralic. On the other hand, you can't overlook that death, but you can do both. You can dedicate a piece of the bar mitzvah speech or something as a memorial to the parent, and at the same time dance and celebrate the bar mitzvah. And I think the same thing is true in camp. You can dedicate a memorial, and you can dedicate a circumscribed time to remember the person. I think it's it's part of that teaching experience that can take place in camp. And then you can leave that and have sports and recreation and concerts and all the other things that are more recreational in camp. It's not a contradiction. We can do it as human beings, and the kids can do it. It's interesting when we've had tragedies in camp and we've come up to the camp to help the campus, whether it's a fellow camper who died or a counselor or something of that sort. Very often the question we get is, how do we have the cantata? How do we have color war? How do we have the trip to the amusement park when this happened? And one of the answers we give them is, what do you think, whoever it is who passed away, what do you think he wants? And the truth is that many people who are leaving this world, if we have a chance to talk to them, very much want the survivors to go on with life and to enjoy life. And so it's not a betrayal. It's very much in service and in tandem with what those who have sacrificed their lives want.
Thanks so much for that, Dr. Blumenthal. I just want to recap that we have a dedicated camp support helpline that is open throughout the summer. You can reach us at 718-686-3230, and we're here to answer your questions. We're here to offer support to your camp staff, and we will be sharing flyers and more advertising soon to share more about our camp helpline. We hope that this webinar has been helpful for you. Again, it's difficult for us to cover everything that was asked within the webinar, but we really do hope that you found this informative and helpful. And I want to thank our wonderful group of panelists here, especially Avi, signing on with full dedication from 3 o'clock in the morning. We hope that you are able to catch some sleep. And I want to wish everyone a good night and best of luck with your camp. And may we hear peace in Israel very, very soon. Good night, everyone.